And I think part of the message here is when to hang back and when it's time to move on. So first, a little piece of background on the book of Mark, just for context, because we're going to be hanging out with Mark for a little while. Biblical scholars believe that the book of Mark was written somewhere around the middle of the 1st century in an unspecified part of the Roman Empire. Why is that hopeful? Unspecified? Well, we know historically that there was a great deal of strife going on. Bonnie Bauman Thurston argues that Mark's gospel is concerned with suffering because Mark's community is in fact a suffering community. These were actually times of terrible persecution for Christians, and the stories were really intended to address a lot of that conflict and change and challenge that were going on. And if you notice, sometimes they're told with that sense of urgency that kind of fits that audience and that intent. And today's reading packs a punch because in a few very short lines, the writer speaks volumes. First, when to hold on. That's the first part we're going to look at. When it is that we want to take pause and lean in, even when it's unexpected or unconventional to do so. Catherine Matthews Huey observes that right here, at the beginning of his ministry, after dramatic and even disturbing experiences, and you'll remember we've talked about some of those, the River Jordan, the sky ripped open, time in the wilderness, unclean spirits shrieking. This is all very dramatic stuff happening. But Jesus' first healing is accomplished through gentle, almost tender touch. Jesus' authority extends from the spiritual healing that we saw last to now moving into the actual physical healing. Last week we read that Jesus was not like the scribes, and this week Mark shows us a pretty good example of exactly why. Because to touch a sick person would mean to become ritually impure. It would mean to become unclean. And when you're unclean, you're set apart from the community. You have to be purified in rituals that vary in complication and in extensiveness and elaborateness and sometimes silliness when I read them. And it all depends on the cause of the uncleanliness. And in this situation, the sick person was a woman, which yielded even more potential uncleanliness. And so touching a sick woman would have been really countercultural. And I think sometimes we can lose sight of how that really would have been pretty radical for Jesus to be doing that. To pick of all people, not the person with authority and might, but somebody's mom. And in her own home, lay his hands on her. That's a really big deal. So this wasn't a casual run-of-the-mill healing, as if there were ever such a thing, right? This is a really big deal, and it would have raised eyebrows, and it would have started murmurings, and probably gotten a few gasps. And it's Jesus deliberately, once again, crossing the boundaries of propriety to show us what really matters. A simple, loving, healing touch. The Greek word for healing that's used in this text is sozo. It's a great word. Everybody should know this word. This is the same word that's used to mean both healing and to mean salvation or restoration. Bonnie Bauman Thurston points out that the fact that the woman goes on to serve shows that she's been, in fact, restored to community. She has, in fact, been saved. Her serving in the story is not just a matter of sexism. It's not like, I healed you, now woman, get my coffee. Right? This is not what we're reading. We're reading the fact that it's actually a lot more holy. So there's even something a little bit transgressive about her serving. It's serving that is sacred. It's serving that empowers the woman here to serve God. And that's the thing. It's what merits Jesus' sticking around for a little bit. This is why he sticks around and kind of leans in for a little bit. It's a relationship where healing happens and where he gets served is life-giving. And it merits the little extra time spent together. The word for serving in Greek is diakone. And you might guess the meaning if you see it written, because it's the root for the modern word deacon. And in the UCC, we're not super high churchy deacony. But what deacons are is when you're talking about, Carl, you gave a funny look. What you're talking about is the person who is like, if the pastor's here, and it's typically a hierarchical kind of thing, then the deacon is right here, like just a couple centimeters below. It's the person who heals and who serves and who does all these other wonderful functions. And many of our churches do use that, and so do traditional churches. And it is a pretty holy office. It's an important deal. And here you have a woman, somebody's mom, in her house, who was just kind of sick with the flu, like many of us have been. And all of a sudden, she gets called to be the very first deacon of the church. This is a big deal. And again, we might just see the serving and think, what's going on, Jesus? But in fact, this is also really countercultural. It's also pretty shocking. It's also pretty stirring up a little bit the expectations. So Richard Swanson even turns the deaconing thing into a verb, and he applies it powerfully to the women who stood at the cross and who had, the text says, deaconed to him throughout his ministry. Jesus, in his staying with her, is acting in love, radical love. Love not expressed, love not felt, Ennis writes, is difficult to trust. God knew the human need for nearness. And isn't that a common need to us all? We need that nearness. Jesus is the incarnation of God's love, which makes it all the more demanding, if frightening, to realize that for some people, we are in fact the only Jesus they will ever meet. Whew, I'll say that again. For some people, we, you and you and you and you, are the only Jesus they will ever meet. What if we at San Dimas Community Church, UCC, are the only Jesus some people are going to meet? How do we live into that responsibility to be God's public relations specialists, to be deacons in the world? How do we live into that responsibility to be these representatives of the divine, to live as if our lives matter that critically that any given moment at the supermarket, crossing the street, driving in traffic on the 405, you might be the only Jesus someone meets? That's pretty heavy, I think. I think that's something good to consider when we're thinking about how are we to serve and to be deacons in the world. And how do we decide when it's time to spend that extra minute and to stay and lean in, and when we are called to move on, let go and move on? Well, after the whirlwind of healing, Jesus got up and went into a deserted place, and there he prayed, according to the scriptures. The disciples were all running around looking for him, which is another theme in these stories. We'll come back to that one in a few weeks. But Jesus didn't linger. He could have stayed. He could have had a successful healing ministry. Word spreads, right? So he didn't need Twitter or some kind of Yelp account or LinkedIn. Word spreads. He could have just had people coming to him, and he already, after this one act of healing, already we see that the word spread that quickly and everybody wanted a piece of the action. So he could have set up a spot. He could have determined a set time each week, a day of the week, and he could have just let people come to him. And he could have had a fantastic gig. He probably would have run into a little less trouble, but I'm sure he still would have had opposition. But no, that's not the path that Jesus takes, is it? He goes out to pray and he discerns the next step. And what's the next step? Moving on. Let's go. Prayer is critical, though. That's where the discernment starts. And that's where we take that time to make sure that we are staying true to our calling. Even when there are other demands on our time, even when it's not super convenient, prayer is how we make sure that we're on the right track. Even when it means getting up before sunrise, even when it means we have to hunt out that solitary place like Jesus did, we still need this prayer time. We need the time to align our steps with God's call. And this is true for us individually as leaders, and you're all leaders in the church. And this is true for us as a community. As a church, we need that time to discern and to be intentional about our prayers for clarity. Now, when I say moving on, though, I don't mean that what's left behind, that excitement of the community when they're faced with miracles and wonders, I don't mean that it's not valuable. That was amazing, wasn't it? That's such a great story, and the excitement, you can just feel it when you read the words. Jesus didn't say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Moving on just means that there's other places that we also need to be. Jesus didn't say, well, we've always done things this way, because this is, after all, his second healing. So we have a little bit of a pattern emerging. So he could have just, stuck to the script, done things a certain way. But as we know from the story, Jesus didn't tend to operate like that very often. There was an unpredictability. Jesus didn't decide out of fear either. Jesus wasn't just freaking out about all these people coming to me. Oh my goodness, what am I going to do? Right? That's not the place that Jesus is coming out of. He didn't even get stuck with a genuine compassion that connects us to people, but that can also make us overstay our welcome in some matters, right? Jesus didn't sit there and overanalyze every healing. Well, if I had healed the lepers first and then the blind people, then maybe it would have gone a little bit better. Jesus moves on. Amen. Grounded in prayer, always discerning, and connected to his community, he moves on to follow his call. And what a wonderful story it is for the rest of us. I'm going to invite us to take a moment in silence to consider prayerfully what those areas might be in our own lives where, might be time to move on. Maybe not. Lean in, stay a little longer. I'm going to give us a moment in silence to consider where those places might be in our life as a church, when it's time to lean into the healing and the serving, and what those areas are where it's time to let go and move on. Take this time in prayer, and may God's wisdom shine on our discerning.